that Boko Haram represents or that MEND represents, can you draw a connection between the subject of this conversation and the violence both in the North and the South?
Yeah, I'm actually going to conclude on that note.
Okay.
That is actually to give that understanding. If you don't have that understanding, you probably will still be going with the previous notion you have that this is actually a religious crisis. But you need to understand that it's not a religious understanding. It is economic, it is political, and it is actually orchestrated and designed by people who want to sustain the corrupt regime that they had in government. And there was a need to divert a complete attention away from other crises that are already going, economics, social, infrastructural. And for them to genuinely even commit resources to the defense. It was as bad as ragtag group of this Boko Haram would be chasing away the military. We're killing the military. About 4 states were actually captured by Boko Haram before the advent of this regime, about several local governments. I did a report with recently on World Bank's monitoring of the utilization of some repatriated funds that were stolen by Abacha. And I went to some of those states, and I couldn't help but wept with the level of havoc that was wreaked on those communities. And the moment you have a change of government, and there was a genuine commitment to the fight against Boko Haram, which is what I was saying, there was a genuine commitment to the fight against Boko Haram. All the states and local governments were actually taken back from the Boko Haram. So it becomes now, like it is, just like a ragtag where all it does is just to carry out suicide bombing, and it was not the usual trend of actually taking or confronting the military like you had before. So the level of corruption that went into the defense, and luckily this is also becoming manifest with the EFCC, the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, investigation of the arms procurement process and the contracts of the past. It showed that while the world was told that Nigerian government was allocating resources to fighting Boko Haram, those resources were actually going into private pockets, and they were finding their ways. A pastor from Nigeria with a private jet owned by a pastor was actually impounded in South Africa with huge hundreds of millions of dollars, which was claimed to be meant for the procurement of arms. And then you would ask yourself, how do you go buy arms with raw cash? So, but with the level of improved transparency and accountability within the system, that is also. I should also say that even in the U.S. there are about $4 billion money from the military government of Abacha that are still within banks in the United States, and these are huge situations that fuels not only just this crisis, but also deprivations. Many of the guys who undertake, or the small children who engage in the suicide bombing, with better education, better social infrastructure, I can assure you they won't get into all those suicide missions.
Would you take the climate question?
I have something to say about that, too.
Okay.
It's a big question and an important one, obviously, but I think a couple of things to say. The future of the oil industry as a going concern and the value attributed to oil companies with reserves is probably a function to a great extent. In the timeline you're thinking about, like the decades-long struggle to prevent temperature rise above 2 degrees Celsius, is probably a function of whether or not electric vehicles emerge as a dominant transportation system around the world. ExxonMobil has been planning for disruptive technologies for a long time. They're constantly evaluating threats to their industry. The only one that's ever, at least during the time that I was reporting and writing that book, the one that really kind of got their attention out the side of their eyes was the possibility of a very fast pivot to electric vehicles, because oil is primarily a transportation fuel. It's also used in the manufacture of plastics, but It's primarily a transportation fuel. The future of electricity doesn't implicate the oil industry the way it does because of the natural gas component. Of course, a company like Exxon is about half a natural gas company now, only half an oil company. But so I think we live in a world of market forces and powerful corporations and big long-term capital investments. Just being realistic, the positive incentive to shift and the consequence for shareholders who own legacy oil and coal companies is going to flow partly from whether or not there's a positive innovation to cleaner transportation. On the electricity side, I think it's a settled matter that despite the Trump administration, that the coal industry is going to have, they're just delaying their decline. They're not going to be rescued. And natural gas is certainly going to be part of a mix, and that's a whole another set of subjects. But it goes back to this question of where pressure points lie. So ultimately, the future of the oil industry will be decided partly in markets and partly by public opinion. One reason why this struggle about corruption that we've been talking about is different from, say, accountability in supply chains for manufacturers of tennis shoes, for example, or coffee, is because the oil industry is not fundamentally a consumer business. They really don't care about public opinion. Yes, there's a brand on a gas station where you fill in your tank, but it's a utility function. Okay, you can boycott Exxon, you can go across the street and fill up at BP. What difference does it make? I mean, you have to fill your tank with gas. And so it's a different set of pressures that are required to move these problems. And the last thing I'd say about public opinion is that on climate and how urgent the climate risks are and whether or not we're willing to pay a price to address those risks, we are the outlier in the United States. The question is settled everywhere else in the world. And we can fulminate and pound the table and withdraw from Paris and isolate ourselves. It's not going to change world opinion. And American opinion will eventually catch up with the rest of the world. It's a strange anomaly. Us and Australia are the two self-interested fossil fuel producers that have managed to confuse our publics about questions that the rest of the world really considers settled, and for good reason.
You want to wind us up?
I'd like to chuck something onto the top of that. I think there's a great deal of urgency to move fast and onwards. And whilst I totally agree with what you just said, it struck me that part of the solution to arriving at electrification constructs that would work comes down to the investment level. And if you had to invest like there was no tomorrow, like there was really no tomorrow, you might pull your finger out and put some extra resources in. So if, for example, I gave you, I don't know what the annual budget is now any longer for oil and gas exploration and production, but if I gave it to you and gave you the world's best scientists and I said, Steve, you've got 5 years, pull your finger out, give us the innovation that will do this, this, and this, the key sort of, storage issues, blah, 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 I reckon you'd have a pretty good shot at it. And so for me, in the end, it comes down to who is making the money. And that then comes back down to us, the people, and how we input into politics. And that, for me, is the nexus with corruption, because there's a whole other level of corruption, in my view, that goes beyond that which is legal or illegal and into the space of capture of the political space. If you ask the question, we won the argument about revenue disclosure in 2003. So what the hell are we still talking about it for? And the reason for that is there is an asymmetry of power at the political level, despite some very brave people, some of whom are in this room, who were willing to take the leap and push a policy position. The US had leadership on this, created a whole disclosure mechanism that the rest of the world followed, and is now abrogating on it. So I think it's about returning back to the leadership, and we, the people, whoever we are in whichever country, need to seize the initiative and get our leaders to actually show some leadership and go back, because we face an existential crisis. Are we going to let the profiteers just get away with it? So to climate risk disclosure, the elephant in the room is how many of the assets do companies have? If there was a policy, and that's where it comes back to capture of the space, there won't be a policy, even though there's a commitment, unless we recapture that space. But they can no longer, post-Paris, rule out that there won't be a policy. which implies you no longer can say, well, I can guarantee this field that I'm about to go into has a lifespan that's economically viable for, say, the next 20 years or whatever. And so since we're now at the stage where there is a growing momentum, despite the setback of the CRA resolution, which I talked about, for project-level disclosure, why shouldn't we have climate risk disclosure on a project-by-project basis? If this is material for us, the people, to know, say in a country like Nigeria, or let's take another country like Uganda that's just embarking on an oil-filled future, you know, if you were a citizen there wondering whether you would want to put up with pollution, for example, as a possible byproduct of going ahead, because you've been sold this line that this is going to create development dollars, but let's say the break-even price is, for argument's sake, $70. I don't know what it is, but there's no infrastructure in place to get it to the coast, so presumably it's going to be high. Let's just say the geology is difficult, so the costs go up. If we actually have climate action that delivers as the beginning of a new regime of electrification of vehicles, the demand will go down, even if the US doesn't do anything. The rest of the world will, because it is in that process. The price will crash, and all of these places where the break-even price is higher, and that will increase as the price carries on going down, will be white elephants. So then we're left with the question of, is Project X, that companies are coming together with these leaders in this country, is it more about the bonus that the leadership of the company will get from booking another reserve, and the prospect of being able to pillage some of the money if you're a corrupt leader on the other side? Or is it actually an economically viable project? So if you think it's economically viable, then disclose it. So we need a regime that will force companies to tell us, project by project, whether or not these are economically viable under a scenario of 1.5 or 2 degrees. And that will be a very interesting scenario to see, because I think we'll find probably a very substantial number of projects out there in the existing portfolio are not economically viable.
Meaning a risk to investors.
Precisely.
So back to your point about leverage, investors in these companies.
And this is going on now to some extent because there are, for example, accounting audits of companies as to whether or not they have properly written down the value of fields, for example. And so this is an area of where people are really beginning to think.
There was a push into the EITI process before the EITI was involved in a bit of its own self-implosion a year ago, but that's sort of coming out of it again. But there was a push to require the standard of EITI would bring in climate risk disclosure. My understanding is Chevron had a conniption. They flipped. There was a, we're not having this. And then the result was a letter, which you can see on the EITI site.
What is the EITI?
The Extractive Industry
Transparency
Initiative. This is a multi-stakeholder initiative which involves civil society, governments, and companies at the table. And there was this flip out, and the Secretariat of the ITI produced a letter in response to the letter that was sent in. The letter that was sent in was extremely well articulated, and frankly, intellectually, there's no real credible arguments against it. The response was utterly inadequate. It was simply the biggest bully in the block said no. And unfortunately for them, civil society are equal players at the table. That is the foundation stone of EITI. So the argument is not finished. This is going to come back and it's going to resurface, and these debates will continue. So watch the space, because we have a beginning of a global project-level disclosure mechanism, which I think has every possibility of requiring, ultimately, climate risk disclosure, which will be of benefit to investors and citizens.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, really thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
We
Thank you to
have
you.
a light meal outside afterwards, and we can be here for just a couple of minutes. We will then actually have to go record something very quickly.
Oh, yes, I forgot about that. This is the one
Tonight on Q&A.
The social and legal response to the issues that black men have is to lock us up, to put us in cages, to stop and frisk us, to treat us as citizens whose rights other people don't respect. We're not full citizens of the United States.
Georgetown University Law School professor Paul Butler takes a critical look at the U.S. criminal justice system and its impact on African American men in his book, Chokehold: Policing Black Men.
There's never been a time where community relations has been anywhere near good. So for a long time, if you were a black person and you called the police to report a crime, if you were the victim, the police just didn't pay that much attention to it. And now the sense is that the police are overwhelmingly in African American communities, but not to protect those communities, but rather to lock folks up.
Tonight at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN's Q&A.
Monday night on The Communicators.
I always like to say that hackers don't hack computers, hackers hack humans.
We're at the Black Hat Conference in Las Vegas talking about cybersecurity and cyber threats with Samil Shah, CEO of NetSquare.
It's not easy to patch a very large organization and keep on patching it month after month. Yes, that's what the recommended thing is, but today we have to really think of proactive defense. We cannot keep reacting to attacks anymore. We have to turn the whole concept around. We have to look for threats. We have to set booby traps. We have to create customized environments. We have to engage in threat hunting.
Watch The Communicators Monday night at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN 2.
Now, from the Sunday shows this morning, a reaction to President Trump's remarks concerning the violence that occurred yesterday at a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. We'll hear from Colorado Senator Cory Gardner, former White House Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci, National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, and Charlottesville Mayor Michael Signer.
Well, this is not a time for vagaries. This isn't a time for innuendo or to allow room to be read between the lines. This is a time to lay blame on bigotry, to lay blame on white supremacists, on white nationalism, and on hatred. And that needs to be said. This president has done an incredible job of naming terrorism around the globe as evil, radical Islamic terrorism, whether it's in Europe or the Middle East. He has said and called it out time and time again, and this president needs to do exactly that today. Call this white supremacism, this white nationalism evil, and let the country hear it, let the world hear it. It's something that needs to come from the Oval Office, and this White House needs to do it today.
I think he needed to be much harsher as it related to the white supremacists and the nature of that. I applaud General McMaster for calling it out for what it is. It's actually terrorism, and whether it's domestic or international terrorism, with the moral authority of the presidency, you have to call that stuff out.
But the question is, why didn't the president do that? You know him well.
Well, I think Alex mentioned one of the reasons why he doesn't like doing that. He likes doing the opposite of what the media thinks he's going to do. I think he's also of the impression that there is hatred on all sides, but I disagree with it. And so, but here's the thing, whether I was the White House Communications Director or not, I don't think you're going to change the president. The president's going to do what he wants to do, how he wants to do it. But I think it's important for the people around him, George, to give them direct advice, to be blunt with him. I think he respects bluntness and he respects candor. And I certainly would have never suggested him doing that.
But is there anyone in the White House right now who says, boy, you just made a real mistake there?
I think people are probably reluctant to tell him the truth. Maybe Ivanka would do that. You saw her tweet this morning. Maybe Jared would do that. But you also got this sort of Bannon-Bart influence in there, which I think is a snag on the president. If the president really wants to execute that legislative agenda that I think is so promising for the American people, the lower middle class people and the middle class people, then he has to move away from that sort of Bannon-Bart nonsense.
So you mean Bannon and Breitbart, Steve Bannon?
That the whole thing is nonsensical.
When he condemned bigotry and hatred on all sides, that includes white supremacists and neo-Nazis. And I think it's clear, I know it's clear in his mind, and it ought to be clear to all Americans. We cannot tolerate, obviously, that bigotry, that hatred that is rooted in ignorance of what America stands for, what America is.
Should we expect to hear, instead of from you, from him, some of those words?
I'm sure you will hear from the president more about this. I mean, this is important to the president to bring all Americans together. He said what we all have to be is all of us have to be Americans first, and that's our common identity as Americans, grounded in our commitment to liberty, to human rights, to equal rights, and to tolerance over this kind of hatred and bigotry.
When you watched all this yesterday, what was your reaction?
It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. You know, as a soldier. what you see in our military is you see men and women from all walks of life, all different backgrounds come together in their common commitment to their country and to each other. And then you see them in combat, fighting courageously for our nation and our values. Everybody bleeds the same color. And we're bound together as soldiers, and we ought to be as a nation, bound together by mutual respect and common commitment to our values.
Was that domestic terrorism yesterday?
I think what terrorism is the use of violence to incite terror and fear. And of course it was terrorism.
So you do classify that as terrorism?
Well, and from a legal sense, there'll be a full investigation, as you know, but certainly I think we can confidently call it a form of terrorism.
You, on one hand, thank the president for condemning the violence, but you added this. You said, I do hope he looks in the mirror, himself in the mirror, and thinks very deeply about who he consorted with during the campaign. What are you referring to there?
It's an old saying: when you dance with the devil doesn't change. The devil changes you. And I think they made a choice in that campaign, a very regrettable one, to really go to people's prejudices, to go to the gutter. I mean, these influences around the country, these anti-Semites, racists, Aryans, Nazis, KKK, they were always in the shadows, but you know, they've been given a key and a reason to come into the light. That's exactly what happened last week. If you looked at the chatter online, they said this will be a shot heard around the world. This will be alt-right 2.0 in Charlottesville. The time has come for this to stop. This should be a turning point. This movement jumped the shark, and it happened yesterday. People are dying, and I do think that it's now on the president and on all of us to say enough is enough. This movement has run its course.
And for more on the situation in Charlottesville, we talked to a reporter who covered the event on Washington Journal.
The New York Times reads, white nationalist protest leads to deadly violence. One of the authors of that article this morning, Cheryl Gay Stolberg, is on the ground in Charlottesville, Virginia. Good morning, Ms. Stolberg. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Good morning.
Well, what can you tell us about the city's mood late last night and this morning? We heard that the governor, Terry McAuliffe, asking for those white nationalists to leave the state. Any evidence that that's happened?
Well, I would say the city's mood is quiet but tense. I did talk to a spokesman for the rally, the white nationalist rally organizer last night. He said that there was nothing planned for today except that they were going to issue a statement and that they're planning to hold a press conference on Monday, possibly in Alexandria, Virginia, or D.C. So I haven't been out on the streets this morning, but I was late last night, and I can tell you that the streets of downtown were very quiet. A lot of police out there patrolling, a lot of streets closed off. So most people who were out there, if they were out there, were media, and very few walking the streets of downtown. Ordinarily, it would be a very lively nightlife on the downtown mall of Charlottesville.
Well, take us back to yesterday morning and what you saw. Tell us about what the flashpoint was between the white nationalist groups and counter-protesters. What happened there?
Well, what the white nationalists started massing in the city park called McIntyre Park around 9 o'clock, and the counter-protesters had gathered at a church for a sunrise service. And each made their way separately to Lee Park, or it's actually called Emancipation Park now. It used to be Lee Park, where the statue of Robert E. Lee was, or is. The white nationalists gathered inside the park, as they had the right to do by their permit, and the counter-protesters encircled the park from the outside. And it was very, very tense, and as more and more and more people came, more white nationalists and more counter-demonstrators, things got violent. I witnessed skirmishes, street fights, people clubbing one another in the street as the white nationalists tried to make their way into Lee Park. And ultimately, I didn't witness the actual flashpoint inside the park, but at around 11 o'clock or so, the police declared an unlawful assembly, the barricades started coming down, and things just turned into absolute chaos.
We're getting reports this morning of the arrest of the driver in that incident with that killed one person, James Alex Fields from Ohio. Have police released any information on the victim, the one person who was killed in that attack?
As of late last night, they had not released a name. They had said it was a 32-year-old woman. They were notifying next of kin. I haven't checked this morning, but I have not heard yet if there's a name released.
What are your coverage plans this morning? Where do you plan to put yourself and to follow today?
Well, I'm only one person. I have colleagues joining me. We'll probably go to some church services because this is a community that really is wrestling with what is happening here and trying to understand. And I myself will be trying to figure out what went wrong. How did this get so out of hand? What happened with the police response? So I'll probably head out and just do a swing around the streets. But frankly, I don't expect much in the way of protest or street action today. I could be wrong, though. So we will take a wait-and-see attitude on that.
Well, when you got down, did you expect much? When you came down, I assume on Friday at some point, were you expecting that there would be tension or perhaps violence?
I didn't know what to expect. Honestly, my gut told me that there would not be violence because the city had taken such great pains to prepare, and because a month ago there was a KKK demonstration here that ended with police using tear gas on the protesters. So my thought was that since the city had a lot of advanced knowledge of this, that they would have found a way to keep the peace. So I didn't really know what was going to happen. I certainly didn't expect things to get so out of hand as they did yesterday, and especially with that terrible, terrible car crashing into the crowd of people. It was just horrific.
Well, Cheryl Gay Stolberg, we appreciate you joining us this morning. We'll look for your reporting today and this coming week at nytimes.com and on Twitter at CherylNYT. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And Vice President Mike Pence and his wife Karen left today to begin their tour of Central and South American countries. First, he meets with the President of Colombia later today. Then over the next 5 days, visits Argentina, Chile, and Panama. Now from Friday's session of the Netroots Nation Annual Conference, a look at social movements and their political platforms. Taking part in the discussion, Minnesota Congressman Keith Ellison. This runs an hour and 25 minutes.
So briefly to set up our first question, we'll say that, as you may have read in the description for this panel, that the last year's Democratic Party's platform was sometimes described as the most progressive party platform in history. But despite a lot of energy and heat and fight that went into creating that platform, there's also been an explosion of outside different organizing platforms. Instead of consolidating inside the party to create a single narrative, there are a number of different outside movements being coalesced, including the People's Platform led by Our Revolution, and a number the Movement for Black Lives platform, Canada's LEAP Manifesto, and lots of others as well. So we're here to discuss the intersections of these outside platforms and the Democratic Party, why the party platform isn't enough in and of itself, and most fundamentally what it means to be a Democrat and a progressive running for office and being supported by Democratic voters today in America. So my first question, we'll start maybe with Representative Ellison and work our way down the line. Discuss, if you would, your favorite parts of the things you think are most important, either in the Democratic platform or in these outside manifestos, and how they're informing your run for office right now and other candidates.
Well, first of all, I think that all of these platforms are very good and healthy. We should encourage people to coalesce around common shared values, progressive values. It's key that we do that. Bernie, when I was a Bernie Sanders supporter and he asked me to serve on the platform drafting committee, I was proud to do so. And we got a lot of good things done, but we didn't get everything done. You know, I mean, I can tell you this, that Bill McKibben, who is such an excellent leader on climate issues, he walked away from there thinking that there was a lot more we could have done and should have done. And so if we don't have other groups doing platforms besides just the Democratic National Committee, then how is the Democratic National Committee going to look at how this this policy might play out, right? It might actually inspire and inform us for when we get together and write another platform and say, hey, that actually was a great idea. Let's look at it. So just having a bunch of them out there is a good thing, and it's a healthy thing. But there's a lot of things I feel really good about it. Let me tell you, nowadays, we take it as given that most of us are for a $15 federal minimum wage, but then it wasn't. Then it was people in the streets demanding it, but we got it in that platform. Also, ending the death penalty. The Democratic Party is on record against the death penalty. That's good. That's a good thing. We also are on for demilitarizing the police and requiring body cameras. Also ending racial profiling, expanding Social Security, enacting a financial transactions tax to curb excessive speculation, modernized Glass-Steagall, and moving our country to 100% clean energy by 2050, and universal health care, which we believe is single payer, and we have so we had a big fight over the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Many of you who might remember the debate, the president was for it, and many of us were not. And nobody wanted to take a position 180 degrees against the president's position. So we basically put together a number of things that we demanded in a new trade platform, and did everything except for said and be against TPP. But we did everything else, and we put everything else in there, including the stuff about the investor-state resolution process and some of the stuff on the patents and a lot of things that we said we were against in there, and it's in the platform now. So I think it's a good idea for us to keep on doing platforms. I mean, I'm a part of something called the Progressive Caucus in Congress. We put together our Progressive Caucus budget. In a way, that's kind of a platform. And I would say that we have found that we have gotten out there strong, and then the Democratic Party proposed budget, has adopted things that we had in our budget as time went on, like the transactions tax, for example, carbon tax, stuff like that. So we've actually helped move them in a forward direction, and we're proud that we did, and we're proud that they agreed to adopt our ideas. So we think that this is, teamwork makes the dream work, right? So let me just say that, we're in a unique moment in history when you've seen since 2008, we've seen over 1,000 seats get lost to Democrats. 950-some state legislative seats, governors, a lot of governorships. We've lost all these seats, and yet simultaneously, America is provably moving to the left. Look at all the minimum wage increases that have been passed, marijuana legalization, and you keep going, marriage equality legalization. We've done all these things where we're moving to the left, whereas our politicians are moving in the other direction. We have got to get our politics lined up with our value system in this country. And that means that all of us have a lot of work to do, and building strong platforms that have broad buy-in is part of it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Representative. I was in Orlando for the final vote. You probably see me on CNN if you go back for a few things that didn't make it into the Democratic platform. And it's very important, especially that we are focusing on climate change, because, this nation and some states in particular, black and brown communities very much in particular, literally have a gun to their heads right now, and we're not taking it seriously enough, quite frankly. We have to be clear, first of all, when we say 100% clean energy, that doesn't mean fracking, first and foremost. That's just got to be clear. And we fought hard to get a platform in Orlando that said no fracking, national fracking ban, like Bernie had on his environmental platform when he was running for president, and that didn't work out. And I think when you do things like that, you're sending a mixed signal to the people. right? Because like it's like we have to act on climate, but we're referring to fracking and frack gas as a bridge fuel, to the future when it's a gangplank to like, it doesn't work out. And secondly, and I'm just going to be brief, I mean, another thing that I think that we missed out on was Palestinian dignity, and that's when you will see me on CNN if you go back to that. It was right after there was a Black Lives Matter unity vote. I remember it, specifically, and it was just like right after that vote, we couldn't even get something passed to like say like you got to chill out with the illegal settlements. Just chill out. Like didn't even say stop. Just chill out, please. And we couldn't get that passed. So you can't like claim dignity for Black lives and then forget about Palestinian lives. That just doesn't add up. So that's what these people platforms are really doing. And I think that just in general, platforms for the people have to be written for the people. So the words are important, but the process of how we get to those words might even be more important.
So thanks for that, Anthony. So I think we need to take a step back for a second, talk about what these platforms are for. Because if they're literally just a bunch of people sitting in a room arguing over something and then putting it on a piece of paper and filing it somewhere, then that was really just a waste of time. What the platforms really are, in my mind, is not for candidates to go, look, I signed this piece of paper, but is for citizens to hold candidates and politicians accountable. Exactly. Saying this is what you said you're going to do or what we're telling you you need to do, and we're going to hold your feet to the fire until you do it. And for example, like it's great that the $15 minimum wage got into the Democratic platform. I'm sad to say that my county executive in Montgomery County became the first Democrat in history to veto a minimum wage increase to $15. So, if we don't, and he's a Democrat. So if we don't say, this is really what it means to be a Democrat, and there's a cost when you go against what Democrats have agreed on, then those platforms aren't going to be meaningful. And that's one of the reasons why we really need people's platforms. We need, whether it's, like we said, Our Revolutions platform, whether it's LEAP, also People's Action as a platform. When it's a group of citizens saying, this is what we expect from you, then those politicians or candidates better deliver, or there's going to be a cost.
Peace, everyone. How's everyone doing? Awesome. So I think we can't be remiss to say that when we talk about movements and we talk about platforms that just a couple of days ago we celebrated the 3rd-year anniversary of the death of Michael Brown. And this year we celebrated the 5th year, or not celebrated, but recognized the 5th year anniversary of the death of Trayvon Martin, which is the reason why my organization exists. So the reason why we're having a conversation about race and climate change and agendas, right, is because Black people have been in the streets nonstop since that day, since Trayvon, since Mike Brown, and subsequently all the other deaths that continue to be impacted by police, right? And I also think that when we talk about agendas, it's not in response to a reaction of what's happening in the moment, but also it's about building a whole new world that actually doesn't exist yet, right? And for Black people, the world that we imagine actually has never existed. And so in order for us to be able to build a real vision that's about Black self-determination and building independent political power, we need to think along some of those lines of what's not even possible, right? What's not in the realm of what is pragmatic right now, but to get us to a place about what can be possible, right? I also like to do this exercise around, Anthony knows about this exercise, that when we talk about what's possible, right, we also have to get grounded in what society has told us. So if everyone closes their eyes for a second and think about what makes them feel safe, where are you? Who are you with? What does it feel like? What does it taste like? What does it sound like? Now, raise your hand if police come to your mind. Raise your hand if prisons come to your mind. Raise your hand if detention centers come into your mind. Raise your hand if surveillance cameras come into your mind. So if I did this exercise right, the things that actually came into your mind were probably your family, having health care, having a job, having food, all those things that actually make us feel safe, right? So at what point does society tell us that all those things, police, prisons, surveillance cameras, detention centers, are actually what's keeping us safe in this country, right? So how do we begin to manifest this in real life? And for Black people, right, for a lot of our communities, it's about really imagining what's actually going to keep us not surviving, but to a place of thriving, right? Living in a place of abundance rather than in scarcity. And so the Vision for Black Lives platform was produced in the wake of the death of Michael Brown, with this kind of in mind, right? How do we actually build a world that doesn't even exist? How do we actually be able to build a base of people that can really organize towards this vision over the long term, right? And so I think that like this platform, the Vision for Black Lives, which kind of really sticks out around ending the war on Black people, reparations, divest and invest, economic justice, community control, and political power. These are fundamental tenets I think a lot of organizations across the country are really pushing forward and has influenced our conversations at the local, state, and national level. And I think by us having this conversation right now, it just proves that.
I think in regards to the Democratic platform, I think it's very, very important that we hold our Democratic incumbents responsible to the platform that they promised us. Or things are going to happen like they did with Bernie Sanders and what's happened recently in West Virginia, like Jim Justice, one of the biggest polluting coal barons in West Virginia. Our Democratic governor was a Republican 2 months prior to him running for office. Then he ran for office as a Democrat, and then he just came out at a Trump rally as a Republican. Then we have incumbents like Joe Manchin that rides the fence as not a Democrat. When the West Virginia Democratic Party adopted a platform in June 2016 that was one of the most progressive Democratic platforms in the nation, and our incumbents are not standing behind that. So that tells me, too, that we need to hold the DNC responsible, and we need to hold our state Democratic parties responsible, and we need to make sure that we have officials in those parties that are standing behind the platforms that we were promised.
I think that there are a lot of people, the heart of the question on what a party platform is literally the definition of what it means to be a Democrat. And I think a lot of us learned last year that not enough people know what that is. And what I'm very proud about when it comes to things like the People's Platform and Summer for Progress is that it allows me as a progressive to rise above and beyond the standards to a gold standard, which includes Fight for 15, to stand up for Black lives, for Medicare for all, for renewable energy economy in not 50 years, 10 years. And there may be a lot of people in this country that are afraid to say those things and are afraid to draw a line in the sand, but the only reason this country is becoming more progressive is because of the activists and advocates in this room pushing and allowing people and getting people enlightened on these issues. And so while I applaud the Democratic Party for, seeing the light a little bit in some of these issues, I think it's up to our leadership. It's because of our leadership. And these platforms allow us to rise above and beyond and to continue to lead instead of just trying to find what's polling well. It's a really important distinction. And it also allows people like Paula Jean and myself to also add a second standard, which is we don't take corporate funds, we don't take dark money, and we don't take PAC money either.
I have three things. The first thing is if you have a platform that doesn't have Black Lives Matter in it, then you don't have a platform. The same thing with LGBTQIA, brothers and sisters, Latino immigrants. Listen, if you don't have the basics of what it is to be a Democrat or to be a good person, a good human, then that's not a platform. Number two, platforms don't come from the top down. All due respect to my congressman over here. Platforms come from the bottom up, right? So if you're a PC and your PC committee doesn't have their own platform to tell your county that they need to adopt this platform, so that county can tell your state to adopt this platform, so your state can tell and give backing to Congressman Ellison and others that are fighting for us from the bottom up. If you don't have that, you don't have a platform. Last thing is, what's the use of a platform if you don't tell nobody about it? Right? So here's the thing. You can have a beautiful platform, but not necessarily have the means or the wherewithal or the guts to tell everybody about your platform. So we need our campaigns, we need our political figures, we need our folks who actually push out energy to actually give our platform to the people. If you live in Batesville, Mississippi, Thomasville, Georgia, Knoxville, Tennessee, places in the South, in the Midwest, the flyover country, and they have no idea what you're talking about, and you don't have the means to do it, and you spend all your money on TV, and you spend all your money, instead of spending all your money on doors so they can talk, so organizers can talk to folks about your platform, then you still don't have a platform. So my question is, do we really have a platform or not? Platforms are in action. Platforms are not about words.
So as we talk more about platforms, I keep on thinking about the fact that I'm an advocate for HBCU students. I realize that in my experience going to HBCUs, a lot of my friends don't vote. And if we're talking about platforms, why aren't people reaching out more to minority-serving institutions? Why aren't universities and organizations in general reaching out and trying to tell people about their importance of their voice? Why aren't we empowering the students, the next generation who's going to continue to vote, right? Why are we not empowering them to vote for you? Like, I get frustrated when I think about the fact that we outside organizations generally try to stay in the 25 and up range because they assume that, well, these people are the ones that we know that are going to vote. But if you want people to continue to vote, if you want people to understand the importance of democracy, you have to come down to the schools and you have to talk to the students because honestly, my generation, we are fed up. And right now, a lot of us, since we have this new man in office, we don't vote. And I've been with a lot of friends who are just like, I don't think it's real. He was going to win anyway, and they've decided for the rest of their lives they're not going to vote. So I think if we need to, right. So if we're going to increase platforms, you need to reach out to these students who have really been disempowered, disenfranchised by what's going on right now in office today.
Great. So we've started talking a little bit about race. We're sort of drifting into it, but I'm going to ask a specific question next, and we're going to sort of reverse order. So start down with Lauren and we'll come back the other way. There's been a lot of analysis that's come out about 2016 in just the last couple of weeks or months. And one of the consistent trends we saw is that where Democrats lost in 2016, it was not actually because white working class voters defected from Barack Obama to Donald Trump. It was because overwhelmingly communities of color, especially women of color, stayed home and didn't vote. We've been talking about it already, but dig in, if you would, panelists, and think, what would it take for the Democratic Party, for Democratic candidates to be the party of people of color? Are we still worthy of that mantle? Are we doing enough? And what else can be done? What needs to be changed at party leadership? What needs to be changed in the platform? And what do you need to see from candidates to really reflect being deserving of that mantle?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll definitely let my fellow panelists speak more on the platform, the Democratic platform. But I know with my generation, we were just really upset. We felt cheated by what happened with the Obama administration. We expected a lot of change, and he received a lot of pushback. Everything that he wanted, I mean, it took years for it to happen. So we just assumed that if they they're not going to put another minority in office because, one, they can't get anything done because Congress and Senate won't allow for it to happen. And two, we just thought that, this was just a gimmick. Obama was a puppet. They elected him into office just to make us, quote unquote, happy and feel like, all right, black people can do it. And we felt like, of 8 years, what did we get out of this? And now we have this man in office.
I think, a lot of African Americans, per se, at this point because there has been such a lack of engagement. And so far, Democratic campaigns think that October is the time to reach out to black churches, and all of a sudden, magically, every single African American is going to show up to the polls. Let me tell you something. Basics doesn't happen in the black community. We can't even get consultants to do good polls in black areas, right? So how are you even going to know where we are, right? So if we've been, and that's been like that since probably Clinton left office. So if it's like that, and you haven't engaged us in years, then black folks have started this thought process of, well, this is just the argument of which white person is going to be in charge. And we feel not like we're engaged, not like we're loved, not like we're a part of the process. Again, what's the point of a platform if nobody knows about it? You got 3 or 4 different platforms in America. And if you talk about the black platform, if there is a black platform, folks are going to be talking about what is going to pay me. How do I get a job? How do I take care of my kids? How do I work this one job and pay all of my bills? How do I take this one piece of health care, this health care argument, and how does it affect me? In general, progressives have decided that they're going to have these platforms where they talk about the issues within their own bubbles, but not how it relates to the black community. There's no resources going into taking that same $15 an hour message, that same health care for all message, and putting it in the hood. This is how it affects black neighborhoods. This is how universal health care will help your life. No one does that. It's a completely missing conversation. And when the conversation does happen, it's at such a high level where the expectation is, see, I said it to you one time, now, time for you to vote. Instead of saying, okay, we're doing deep organizing to make sure that this organizer that we pay is in this neighborhood so Miss Francie Mae knows that what $15 an hour means. So that Miss Susan knows what universal health care means. So when somebody says Medicare for all, they have a good understanding of it. Right now, they don't even get engaged. And you wonder why you lose races. 15% of the total vote. You can't win a Democratic primary without black folks. You can't win the presidency without African Americans and Latinos. So if you're not talking to them and you're not delivering your platform to them, then you're completely missing the boat. Thank you.
I think that if the Democratic Party wishes to be inclusive, then they need to have the courage to stand up for the communities, for the votes that they seek, period. And I think, you know, we know what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement. Rikers Prison is in my district, and the silence is deafening on the fact that we have a living, breathing human rights violation in our land, in America. And we're also being told to wait 10 years to close it. We know what's going to be happening in those next 10 years, and we have the capacity to close it earlier. But then also, you know, as a Latina, I think sometimes we need to have greater imagination on what there is to offer the Latino community beyond just immigration reform. It's not, Latinos is not just immigration reform, and even then, there has been no immigration reform. So is it a surprise that we don't see the animus from Latino voters for the Democratic Party? I'm Puerto Rican, my family's Puerto Rican, and under a Democratic administration, we saw the corporate takeover of 3 million American citizens, and all of their public utilities are being auctioned off to the highest Wall Street bidder. Public utilities are going to you know, capital investment corporations, and we're seeing things like tolls in Puerto Rico. Tolls are being sold off to corporations, and if you think that that is just isolated to the island, it's just a practice run for the next recession to what they're going to do to Detroit, what they're going to do for Birmingham, what they're going to do in the Bronx. It's just batting practice. And so we need to have the courage to stand up, not because we want the votes of communities of color, but because this is a country for everybody, and we fight for everybody, and we fight for a living wage, we fight for a dignified life for every American, and it's American values that we're fighting for.
I don't think people of color have stood behind the Democratic Party because Democrats have not stood behind them. At this day and age, we have to have a movement called Black Lives Matter. When children are getting shot down in the streets and we're not protecting them, how do we expect them to come out of their houses and vote? When Flint, Michigan is denied water. When there's people, their children are getting taken because they can't pay their water bills. You know, when people in Appalachia even, and I'm not of color, we have to beg for something so basic as a clean glass of water. We're talking about platforms here, but we're talking about human beings. Human beings that are still dying in 2017, and people are not quite treated equally and fair in this country. And there's a big problem if we are not doing something about it. I'm a white woman in Appalachia. 90% of Appalachia is white. We're treated bad. We're still not treated bad as people of color. We have to bind together and treat people like human beings, because that's what we are.
I love the agitation that's happening. I'm going to agitate a little bit more. If we look at Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Laquan McDonald, Flint, Michigan, they've all happened under Democratic leadership. Yep. The responses to black people being in the streets, BC and St. Louis, right? The folks that made the decisions to send tanks to tear gas black folks in St. Louis was Democrats. And so I think about that I think about that quote. I'm like forgetting the name now, but about what we know about liberalism, right? And I think that like we really need to see bold action and see like have Democrats have a backbone in order to fight for black people and for other people of color, right? Because we've seen through history that like was said, Democrats have not been on our side, but also not even in the case of not having been on our side, but have also have impacted us through violent means, right? Mm-hmm. And so we need to be really real about how those impacts like isolate a community from actually feeling like our needs are being met. And so it's actually requiring of us and outside our movements to really be able to challenge Democrats and the right, but especially Democrats, to like really hold them accountable to say whether or not you are on our side and are you on the freedom side, mm-hmm. or are you not, mm-hmm. right? Because I think for a lot of us, right, this is a life or death issue, and political parties, politics is a life or death issue. And for us in the last few years, I think the crisis has even gotten higher. And so I think in relationship to the movements and agendas and the reality of democratic representation of black and brown people, I think folks need to have a backbone, and that we need to be able to hold their feet to the fire. That's
right. So I think, of course, as we all know, right, the whole history of this country and the modern success of this country is, of course, built on the backs and with the blood and the sweat of people of color in this country, and then through colonialism all over the world. And so I think for a white person to stand up and say that they're going to support black and brown lives really gives us enormous obligation to do something, right? Not just to say that or have it on a piece of paper. We need to use that privilege to amplify the voices and struggles of other people. And then for me, that means not just saying it, and not just inviting people to the table, mm-hmm. but actually showing up for somebody else's struggles, right? If we say, gee, why aren't our organizations more diverse? It's because your organizations started out the wrong way, started on the wrong foot, period. There are organizations already doing the work, and we just need to show up and amplify those voices and use whatever power we have to help those struggles that are already going on. And then also, I think for our campaigns, progressive campaigns are not about electing individuals who are somehow magically going to make change. Our campaigns have to reflect the change we want to see, and that means both in the work we do, in the people we hire, right? It means making sure we're hiring people of color, making sure we're not, expecting rich white kids, college kids to be our interns, but actually making sure we pay a living wage to our campaign staff. Right, exactly. So, right, so we can start, even if those of us up here who are running, we need to start the day we decide to run, we need to start making that change and being that example, whether we win or not.
And when you hire them, you have to listen to them.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. I'm going to keep on the context of agitation of Brother Dante, because I'm pretty agitated with the Democratic Party, I have to be honest. I think African Americans in particular, African American women specifically in particular, have gotten a worse return on investment from the Democratic Party than anyone that got screwed over by Bernie Madoff, period. Been close to 50 years of steadfast electoral loyalty, and the return on investment has not been good. So I had to start there. Yes, Hillary lost, but before Hillary lost, Brother Bernie lost too, for many of the same reasons. And I have to say, while I'm on camera and to this room, that, I need white progressives, instead of spending so much time trying to convince people of color that Bernie's not racist, which is something we don't